Ernest Shackleton could feel his heart pounding against his ribcage, that same damaged heart that had nearly killed him. 6 years earlier, the heart that doctors warned could stop at any moment under extreme stress. He stood at 88 degrees, 23 minutes south latitude on January 9, 1909, his beard crusted with ice, his cheeks blackened by frostbite, his body consuming itself from starvation. The wind cut through his clothing like a knife, finding every gap in the layers of wool and windproof cloth that separated him from the minus 48-degree air. Behind him stretched 1,700 miles of frozen hell, crevasses that could swallow a man without warning, blizzards that reduced visibility to arm's length, an endless white plain where the glare of sun on ice burned through snow goggles and left men temporarily blind. Before him lay 97 nautical miles of featureless white and the South Pole. He had enough food to reach it. What he did not have was enough food to get back. 3 men waited beside him in that terrible silence. Frank Wild, his most trusted companion, whose quiet determination had never wavered through weeks of starvation. Jameson Adams, limping on a leg that had been kicked to the bone by a dying pony on the first day of their march, who had somehow walked 1,700 miles on that injured limb without complaint. And Eric Marshall, the expedition doctor whose medical supplies had long since run out, who could only watch as his companions deteriorated and offer nothing but encouragement. They had walked farther south than any human beings in the history of the world. Their breath crystallized instantly in the frozen air, forming little clouds of ice crystals that glittered in the endless Antarctic sunlight. 10 days, perhaps 14, and they could stand at the bottom of the earth, immortal forever. But the mathematics of survival told a different story. Every step forward was a step they would have to retrace on diminishing rations. Every day toward glory was a day subtracted from life. And so Ernest Shackleton made the decision that would define his legacy. He planted the Union Jack in the snow, photographed his companions at their furthest point, and turned around. Why would a man walk 1,700 miles toward a dream and stop 97 miles short? What calculation of body and spirit leads someone to choose survival over immortality? And what does it tell us that this apparent failure would later be called, by the man who actually reached the South Pole, the most brilliant incident in the history of Antarctic exploration? The answer lies not in what happened on that frozen plateau in 1909, but in everything that came before and everything that would come after. 23 years earlier, a 16-year-old boy named Ernest Shackleton walked up the gangway of the square-rigged sailing ship Houghton Tower in Liverpool Harbor, leaving behind the comfortable boredom of Dulwich College for a life that would teach him what cold really meant. The Shackleton family was Anglo-Irish, rooted in County Kildare since Abraham Shackleton had crossed the Irish Sea in the 18th century to establish a school that would educate Edmund Burke himself. But young Ernest showed no aptitude for scholarship. He devoured adventure stories with an intensity that alarmed his teachers, dreaming of distant horizons while his classmates conjugated Latin verbs. His father, a doctor, urged him toward medicine. Ernest wanted the sea. The merchant navy was the hard way to become a sailor. No purchased commissions, no family connections, just 4 years of hauling frozen ropes and surviving Cape Horn in winter storms. The Northwestern Shipping Company took apprentices aboard sailing vessels that rounded the Horn on the South American run, carrying cargo to Valparaiso and back through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Imagine yourself on the deck of a sailing vessel rounding the Horn, where the Atlantic and Pacific collide in perpetual fury. The spray freezes on impact, coating every rope and rail with ice that must be chipped away by numb fingers before the rigging can be worked. The ship tilts at angles that seem impossible, waves taller than the masts crashing over the bow, the deck awash with freezing water that soaks through oilskins and wool alike. Below decks, everything is damp, your clothes, your bedding, the very air you breathe. The ship groans and creaks as it fights the waves, timber straining against timber, and you wonder if this voyage will be your last. You are 16 years old, And you learn very quickly that social standing means nothing when frozen spray is coating the rigging and only competence keeps you alive. This brutal democracy of the sea forged something in Shackleton that no classroom could have created. The merchant service cared nothing for your father's profession or your family's connections. What mattered was whether you could haul a rope, read a chart, keep your head when the storm hit, and lesser men panicked. By 1894, Shackleton had passed his examination for second mate. 2 years later, he qualified as first mate. By 1898, at just 24 years old, he held his master's certificate, legally qualified to command any vessel on any ocean. He had risen through the merchant navy, not through connections, but through competence, learning to lead men by working alongside them rather than standing above them. It was the first lesson that would later save 28 lives. But the merchant service, however demanding, could not satisfy his ambitions. The golden age of sail was ending, replaced by steam and commerce and predictability. Shackleton sensed that his destiny lay elsewhere, in the blank spaces of the map, in the places where no human had ever stood. He joined the Royal Geographical Society, attending lectures on exploration, cultivating connections with men who might open doors to adventure. When the opportunity came to join Captain Robert Falcon Scott's discovery expedition to Antarctica in 1901, he seized it with both hands, talking his way into the appointment through charm and persistence, convincing influential men to recommend him for the position of third officer aboard a ship bound for the frozen South. The meeting of Shackleton and Scott would shape polar exploration for a generation. They could hardly have been more different. Scott was a Royal Navy man through and through, rigid, hierarchical, uncomfortable with civilians aboard his vessel, a man who maintained strict separation between officers and men even in the confined quarters of an Antarctic winter station. Shackleton was everything Scott was not. Gregarious, charismatic, genuinely popular with the crew, a man who would share his last biscuit with the lowest seaman and think nothing of it. During the long Antarctic winter of 1902, trapped in close quarters at McMurdo Sound with little to do but wait for spring, Shackleton's natural leadership qualities began to threaten Scott's authority. The men liked Shackleton. They respected Scott. There is a difference, and Scott felt it keenly. The confrontation came on the ice. In November 1902, Scott selected Shackleton and expedition Dr. Edward Wilson to accompany him on the southern journey, an attempt to push as far toward the South Pole as humanly possible. Picture 3 men setting out across the Ross Ice Shelf with sledges and 19 dogs, none of them possessing adequate skills for such an undertaking. They could not ski properly, had barely practiced with the equipment before attempting to use it in earnest. They did not understand how to handle sled dogs effectively, treating them as beasts of burden rather than partners in travel. They had packed inadequate food and knew nothing about preventing scurvy, that ancient sailor's curse that would soon make its presence felt. It was a journey of ambition and ignorance in equal measure. For nearly 2 months they struggled southward, their dogs dying one by one from exhaustion and improper feeding, their own bodies beginning to fail as the scurvy took hold. The landscape offered no mercy, endless white stretching to every horizon, broken only by sastrugi, wind-carved ridges of hardened snow that made sledge hauling an exercise in constant struggle. The temperature dropped as they traveled south, the cold penetrating through every layer of clothing, numbing fingers and toes, frosting eyelashes until the men could barely see. On December 30th, 1902, they reached their furthest point, 82 degrees, 17 minutes south, having traveled approximately 460 miles farther south than any human beings before them. They were still 400 miles from the pole, and they were dying. All 3 men showed symptoms of scurvy, bleeding gums, weakness, a bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement agony. But Shackleton suffered worst of all. His larger frame demanded more calories than their meager rations could provide, and an undiagnosed heart condition was making its presence felt in ways that would later nearly kill him again on the Nimrod expedition. He coughed blood, the red staining the snow where he spat, He suffered fainting spells that left him lying on the ice while his companions watched helplessly. There were days when he could barely help pull the sledge, forced to ride upon it while his companions hauled, the ultimate humiliation for a man of his pride. He could see the pity in their eyes, and worse, he could see Scott's growing contempt. The return journey became a race against physical collapse. 3 men staggering across an endless white emptiness while death walked beside them. They survived. They made it back to the ship on February 4th, 1903, after 93 days and 960 miles of travel, more dead than alive but still breathing. And then Scott made a decision that would haunt both men for years. Shackleton would be sent home on the relief ship Morning. The official reason was health. Scott declared that Shackleton ought not to risk further hardships in his present state of health. The whispered truth was that Scott was removing a rival whose popularity threatened his authority. Other sick men remained with the expedition. Only Shackleton was sent away. Have you ever been fired from a job you loved? Have you ever watched an opportunity disappear over the horizon while knowing that everyone believed you had failed? Imagine standing on the deck of the Morning, watching Antarctica recede into the mist, the white continent growing smaller and smaller until it vanishes entirely, carrying with you not the glory of conquest, but the shame of dismissal. The seabirds wheel overhead, indifferent to your pain. The ship pitches and the southern ocean swells, and you grip the rail to steady yourself, knowing that you are sailing away from everything you dreamed of achieving. Imagine reading, 2 years later, the expedition leader's published account blaming your illness for the failure to reach the pole. The accusation was a knife in Shackleton's heart, and he never quite forgave Scott for it. But here is where Shackleton's character revealed itself. Where another man might have retreated into bitterness, nursing his wounds in private, accepting that his Antarctic career was over, Shackleton transformed his shame into fuel. He would return to Antarctica. He would succeed where Scott had declared him a failure. He would prove them all wrong. The humiliation of being sent home became not an ending, but a beginning, the spark that would ignite everything that followed. The Nimrod expedition of 1907 to 1909 was Shackleton's answer to Scott's dismissal, but it was also a race against creditors and common sense. For years after returning from the discovery, Shackleton scrambled to raise funds, working as a journalist, as a secretary to a member of parliament, even standing for election himself, all while nursing his Antarctic dreams in whatever spare moments he could find. Finally, in February 1907, he secured a breakthrough. His employer, William Beardmore, along with other businessmen who saw publicity value in Antarctic conquest, agreed to guarantee a bank loan of £20,000. It was barely enough. Every corner had to be cut. Think about what it means to launch an expedition to the most hostile environment on Earth with insufficient funds. The Nimrod herself was a 41-year-old former whaling vessel, barely seaworthy, so overloaded when she departed that her plimsoll line submerged by nearly 2 feet, leaving barely 1 meter of freeboard between deck and waterline. The ship creaked and groaned in even moderate seas, and experienced sailors looked at her with barely concealed alarm. To save coal for the expedition itself, Shackleton arranged for the steamer Cunha to tow the Nimrod 1,500 miles toward Antarctica, a humiliating arrangement that saw his expedition ship dragged behind another vessel like a toy on a string, while the New Zealand government paid half the cost. It was the entrepreneurial equivalent of a startup founder maxing out credit cards while seeking angel investors, desperate measures driven by a vision that others could not quite see. This pattern, too, would prove instructive. Modern venture capitalists preach the gospel of failing fast, recognizing early when an approach is not working, pivoting to preserve resources for another attempt. Companies that cling too long to failing strategies burn through their capital and collapse, while those that recognize reality and adapt can survive to succeed another day. Shackleton understood this principle a century before Silicon Valley codified it. He would push to the limits of the possible, but not beyond. He would know when to fold his hand. The expedition established its base at Cape Royds in February 1908, 15 men. One wooden prefabricated hut measuring 33 by 19 feet, and the Ross ice shelf stretching to infinity in every direction. But what happened inside that hut was as revolutionary as anything that happened on the ice. While Scott's expeditions maintained rigid naval hierarchy with separate quarters and dining for officers and men, Shackleton created something unprecedented: a community. All members of the shore party lived, worked, and ate together without demarcation between ranks. Two-man cubicles lined the walls, with curtains providing minimal privacy. A massive American cooking stove they called Mrs. Matter. Sam dominated the living space, its warmth barely adequate against the Antarctic cold. The smell of coal smoke, wet wool, and unwashed men permeated everything. Shackleton himself was the only one with a private room, but this separation served practical rather than hierarchical purposes. He needed space to plan in private, to make decisions without the weight of watching eyes. But when it came to the hard work, he worked alongside his men. Consider how radical this was for 1908. Class distinctions in Edwardian England were as visible as walls, as unmovable as mountains. The idea that officers and ordinary seamen might eat at the same table, share the same living space, treat each other as equals in the face of Antarctic hardship, this was genuinely revolutionary. And it worked. The expedition produced not just geographic achievements, but genuine camaraderie. They printed a book, Aurora Australis, the first publication ever produced in Antarctica, with Wilde and Joyce working the press in freezing conditions, passing lit candles beneath the printing plates to keep the ink from congealing, binding the finished copies in wood from packing crates and leather from horse harnesses. They made the first ascent of Mount Erebus, Antarctica's second, highest volcano at nearly 4,000 meters, watching it erupt above them while they climbed, steam and volcanic gases shooting thousands of feet into the thin Antarctic air. They created a community that would have been impossible under Scott's rigid command structure. This inclusive leadership was Shackleton's second great lesson, one that modern management theory has spent decades rediscovering. In crisis situations, teams follow leaders they trust personally rather than leaders with merely positional authority. Hierarchy maintains order in stable conditions. Shared experience and genuine respect preserve unity when everything is falling apart. Harvard Business School teaches Shackleton's leadership as its most popular case study precisely because his lessons transcend the specific context of Antarctic exploration. They apply to any organization that faces unexpected challenges. 6 years later, this principle would prove the difference between life and death. The Southern journey began on October 29, 1908. 4 men, Shackleton, Wilde, Adams, and Marshall, set out with 4 Manchurian ponies and a plan to cover 1,700 miles in 91 days, an average of nearly 19 miles per day across terrain no human had ever traversed. Imagine yourself in their boots. The temperature hovering around minus 20 degrees Celsius, the ponies struggling through soft snow where dogs might have thrived, your supplies dwindling faster than anticipated because the animals cannot maintain the required pace. The mathematics of survival occupied Shackleton constantly. How much food remained? How many miles to the next depot? What was the minimum daily intake that would keep them moving? He cut rations from 91 days to 110 days, calculating that they could survive on constant hunger if it meant reaching their goal. On November 26th, they passed Scott's 1902 farthest south record of 82 degrees 17 minutes. Shackleton's party had covered the same distance in 29 days that had taken Scott 59, but the true prize lay ahead: the Beardmore Glacier. No one had ever seen what Shackleton found. A river of ice, 125 miles long and 25 miles wide, flowing through the Transantarctic Mountains like a frozen highway to the polar plateau, climbing 7,000 feet to the South Polar Plateau at its summit. Crevasses split its surface into a maze of frozen danger, hidden snow bridges that might collapse under a man's weight, dropping him into blue ice depths from which no rescue was possible. The 4 men became the first human beings to set foot on that high, frozen plain, a geographic discovery that would reshape scientific understanding of the continent and provide the route that both Amundsen and Scott would later use in their race to the pole. Shackleton had literally mapped the way to the bottom of the world. But by early January 1909, the party was operating at the absolute margins of human endurance. They faced temperatures dropping to minus 48 degrees Celsius while camping at 9,500 feet of elevation. Their caloric intake had fallen to less than half the 6,000 calories daily required for such exertion. They were quite literally starving while walking marathon distances each day. Frostbite gnawed at their extremities, blackening fingers and toes. Altitude brought nosebleeds and dizziness and a constant buzz of hypoxia that made clear thought nearly impossible. They were starving, freezing, and exhausted beyond anything they had imagined, and the pole was still over 90 miles away. What would you do? Think about the modern parallel of summit fever in mountaineering, that dangerous psychological state where climbers become so focused on reaching the peak that they ignore the signs of approaching disaster. 137 people have died on Mount Everest since 1922, the majority during descent rather than ascent. They reached the summit. They could not get home. The mountain does not care about your ambition, neither does the Antarctic. Or consider NASA's mission abort protocols, developed after Apollo 13 became a successful failure in April 1970. Gene Kranz's famous declaration, "Failure is not an option," is often misunderstood. He did not mean they had to reach the moon at any cost. He meant they had to bring the crew home alive. When the original mission became impossible after an oxygen tank exploded halfway to the moon, the definition of success changed instantly. Landing on the lunar surface was forgotten. Survival became everything. The astronauts survived because mission control recognized that human lives mattered more than mission objectives. This is precisely what Shackleton understood at 88 degrees south, 6 decades before Apollo 13 made the same calculation. On January 9, 1909, Shackleton made his final calculation. He could reach the pole. 10 days, perhaps 14, and he would stand where no human had ever stood, his name written forever in the annals of exploration. But the food depot at Mount Hooper lay 150 miles away. Beyond that, the next depot was 150 miles farther. The entire distance back to Cape Royds stretched over 800 miles. Every day forward was a day subtracted from their margin of survival. Every mile toward glory was a mile that had to be retraced on diminishing strength. He gathered his 3 companions on that frozen plateau. They discussed it briefly, but the mathematics admitted no argument. One of his colleagues would later calculate that delaying the return by even a single hour would have killed all 4 men. Standing 97 miles from immortal fame, Ernest Shackleton chose to turn back. "We have shot our bolt, and the tail is 88 degrees 23 minutes south." He sent a letter to his wife Emily that would become one of the most quoted lines in exploration history. "I thought, dear, that you would rather have a live ass than a dead lion." The self-deprecating humor cannot disguise the profound shift in values this represents. Shackleton was acknowledging that he had failed by the standards of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. By the measures of glory that drove men to risk everything for a spot on the map, he had fallen short. But he was also asserting something more important, that the lives of his men mattered more than any geographic prize, that bringing his people home was itself a form of success. This is the principle that modern medical triage has codified: the willingness to accept limited losses to save the maximum number of lives. Emergency physicians must sometimes abandon resuscitation attempts to reach patients with greater survival probability, a brutal calculus, but one that saves more lives than the alternative. Military commanders must retreat to preserve forces for future engagement, the doctrine embodied by the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, when the British Army's escape from France transformed tactical defeat into strategic survival, preserving the forces that would eventually return to liberate Europe. Business leaders must recognize when to abandon failing strategies to preserve companies and teams, as Netflix did when it pivoted from DVD rental to streaming, or as countless startup founders have done when they realized their original vision would not work. The ability to redefine success when circumstances change, this is not weakness, it is wisdom. The return march tested that wisdom to its absolute limits. The four men stretched 91 days of rations to 120 days, eating portions that would have seemed starvation rations to a Victorian workhouse. They walked through blizzards that confined them to their sleeping bags for days at a time, burning precious calories simply to stay warm while making no progress. Dysentery struck them, adding one more misery to bodies already pushed beyond endurance. Marshall lost 2 stone of body weight, his frame collapsing in on itself until his clothes hung loose as sacks. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. There were moments when it seemed impossible that all 4 could survive, but Shackleton refused to lose a man. He shared his own rations with the weakest members of the party, going hungry so others could eat. He stayed awake during storms to ensure his companions did not freeze, checking on them through the long Antarctic nights. He drove them forward with a combination of encouragement and sheer force of will, knowing that stopping meant dying, that the only way home was through. And on March 4, 1909, all 4 members of the Southern Party staggered aboard the Nimrod with hours to spare before the ship's scheduled departure. Every man survived. Every man came home. The aftermath brought Shackleton what he had dreamed of since his humiliating dismissal from the Discovery: recognition, knighthood, the acknowledgement that he had achieved something extraordinary. He was celebrated as the man who had traveled farther south than any human in history, who had pioneered the route to the pole, who had brought every member of his expedition safely home. But there was also, always, the bitter knowledge of those 97 miles. He had come so close. And in December 1911, Roald Amundsen planted the Norwegian flag at the South Pole. A month later, Robert Falcon Scott reached the same spot and died on the return journey, along with his entire polar party. The man who had sent Shackleton home as a failure perished doing exactly what Shackleton had refused to do. Pushing beyond the point of no return. Scott reached the pole. Scott never came home. Consider the irony. Scott achieved what Shackleton did not. He reached the pole. History remembers him as a tragic hero. But which is the greater achievement? To die reaching your goal, or to live by recognizing when the goal has become impossible? Harvard Business School teaches Shackleton's expedition as its most popular leadership case study, examining how a man who failed to cross Antarctica has become history's greatest example of successful leadership. Professor Nancy Cohn's analysis demonstrates what Amundsen understood when he called Shackleton's turn back brilliant, that the measure of a leader is not the distance traveled, but the people brought home. Shackleton was not finished with Antarctica. In 1914, he announced a new expedition, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, an attempt to cross the entire continent from sea to sea, an 1,800-mile journey across the most hostile landscape on Earth. The Endurance, arguably the strongest wooden ship ever built, her name chosen deliberately to embody Shackleton's family motto, carried him and 27 men into the Weddell Sea, where pack ice seized the vessel in January 1915 and held it in a frozen grip until November, when the pressure finally crushed the hull and sent the ship to the bottom. What happened next is one of the great survival epics in human history. 28 men stranded on floating ice floes, 281 days drifting with the pack until they could launch. 3 small boats toward Elephant Island, a desolate rock, 200 miles from the Antarctic Peninsula. Then Shackleton and 5 companions sailing 800 miles across the most dangerous ocean on Earth in a 22-foot lifeboat called the James Caird, through hurricane-force winds and waves that reached 60 feet, navigating by sextant glimpses of the sun when the clouds briefly parted, knowing that missing their target island meant death in the open ocean. A 36-hour crossing of South Georgia Island's mountainous interior through terrain no human had ever traversed without proper climbing equipment to reach a whaling station on the far coast where rescue might be found. And finally, after 4 failed attempts blocked by pack ice, the rescue of every man left behind on Elephant Island. 28 men, 0 deaths. When Shackleton's rescue ship finally reached Elephant Island on August 30th, 1916, he stood at the rail and called out to the shore. "Are you all well?" Frank Wild, the same man who had stood beside him at 88 degrees south, the man who had waited 4 months on that desolate rock, maintaining discipline and hope in impossible circumstances because his faith in Shackleton's return was absolute, answered with 4 words that justified everything. "We are all well, boss." The philosophy that seemed like failure in January 1909 was actually the moment Ernest Shackleton became the leader who would bring them all home. He had learned the lesson that Scott, reaching the pole and dying on the return, never understood. Glory means nothing if your people do not survive. Roald Amundsen, the man who actually conquered the South Pole, understood. His assessment of Shackleton's turnback carries weight precisely because of its source, the most brilliant incident in the history of Antarctic exploration. The Norwegian who succeeded where Shackleton fell short recognized what made Shackleton extraordinary, not the miles he covered, but the men he preserved. In our own age of corporate scandals and leadership failures, of executives who drive companies into disaster rather than acknowledge that their strategy has failed, of politicians who sacrifice lives for ideological consistency, of mountain climbers who push to summits they cannot safely descend, Shackleton's 97-mile decision offers something precious. Proof that the greatest leadership is not about achieving the goal at any cost, but about knowing when the cost has become too high. The men who served under Shackleton understood this better than anyone. Decades after the Endurance expedition, when asked what made Shackleton different from other leaders, they spoke not of his bravery or his ambition, but of something simpler. He cared about them. He noticed when a man was struggling and found ways to ease his burden without making a show of it. He shared his own rations when food ran short. He maintained hope when all seemed lost, not through empty optimism, but through practical action that demonstrated his unwavering commitment to their survival. First Mate Lionel Greenstreet captured the essence of it years later when he said that Shackleton never let you feel your troubles were your own. This is why his story endures. Not because of the miles he traveled or the records he set, but because of the lives he saved and the example he left behind. Ernest Shackleton died on January 5, 1922, aboard the Quest during his 4th Antarctic expedition. His heart, the same heart that had failed him on the Discovery expedition, that had labored on the Nimrod March, that had somehow carried him across South Georgia Island, finally gave out at 47 years of age. He is buried in the Whalers Cemetery at Grytviken, South Georgia, his grave facing south toward the continent he loved and the pole he never reached. On his headstone is carved a line from Robert Browning. "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life's set prize." But the prize Shackleton strove for was not a spot on the map. The prize was his men's lives. And that prize he won completely. 97 miles from the South Pole, Ernest Shackleton turned around. In that moment of apparent failure, he became immortal in a way that reaching the pole could never have achieved. He became the man who brought them all home.